The fire that fell from the heavens did not look like the wrath of God, nor did it resemble the fiery breath of dragons that the superstitious peasants whispered about in the valleys below. It was something far colder, far more violent, and infinitely more terrifying. It was a wound in the fabric of the night sky, a screaming tear of violet light that severed the darkness above the Swiss Alps. Sir Thomas of Acre had seen men burn. He had stood in the stone courtyards of Paris and watched the smoke of his brothers rise into a gray autumn sky, carrying the scent of betrayal and charred flesh. He knew what fire looked like when it was fed by wood, oil, and hate. But the thing that tore through the clouds that night, turning the midnight snow into a blinding, sterile day, was not born of this earth. It was a silent catastrophe, followed seconds later by a sound that felt less like a crash and more like the mountains themselves were cracking in half. The impact shook the very teeth of the ridge, sending a cascade of loose shale and ancient ice tumbling down the precipice, rattling the bones of the man who hid in the dark. Thomas gripped the hilt of his sword, the only thing of value he had left in this world, and waited in the shadows of the limestone cave. His first instinct, honed by 3 years of hunting and being hunted, was that the King of France had finally found him. Philip the Fair, the architect of the Order's destruction, had eyes everywhere. Thomas assumed the light was some new, hellish siege weapon, or perhaps the final judgment the priests had threatened him with. He was the last of them, or at least, he felt like the last. It was the winter of 1307, and the order of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon had been shattered into dust. Thomas was living like a wolf, freezing, starving, and waiting for death to claim him before the bounty hunters could collect the price on his head. But curiosity is a curse that outlives hope, and the silence that followed the crash was heavy, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. He descended the ridge, his boots crunching on ice that had been flash-melted by the heat of the event and instantly refrozen into a slick, obsidian-like glass. The wind howled through the pass, biting at his exposed face with invisible teeth, but as he drew closer to the impact zone, the biting cold was replaced by a strange, dry heat. The air tasted of ozone, copper, and burning metal, a scent Thomas had never known, sharp and chemical, stinging his nostrils. His instincts screamed danger, the kind of primal warning a prey animal feels when the predator is unseen but present. Yet, he pushed forward. In the center of the crater, which smoked and hissed as the snow turned to steam, lay a twisted hulk of silver. It wasn't iron, and it certainly wasn't steel. It possessed a fluidity, a lack of seams and rivets, that defied the logic of the smithy. It groaned like a dying beast, deep resonant thrums vibrating through the ground and up into Thomas's legs. Lights, pale and rhythmic, pulsed along its flank like the heartbeat of a giant leviathan beached on the shores of the world. Thomas approached, his long sword drawn, his breath steaming in the bitter air. He expected a demon. He expected a monster sent by the devil to tempt him in his final hours. A section of the hull hissed, a sound like 1,000 snakes, and peeled away with a mechanical fluidity that made him flinch. The interior glowed with a soft, sterile hum, a white light that cast no shadows. And there she was. She dragged herself from the wreckage, coughing up a fluid that shined like mercury in the moonlight. She was tall, impossibly slender, her limbs elongated in a way that looked fragile yet powerful. She was clad in a suit that looked like a second skin of woven shadow, a material that seemed to absorb the light around it. When she looked up, Thomas didn't strike. He froze. The sword, heavy with the blood of Saracens and the weight of his failures, wavered in his grip. Her face was human, yet terrifyingly perfect in its geometry. Her skin was the color of moonlight on snow, pale and luminescent. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were wide, completely black, holding the depth of a starless void. There was no white, no iris, just an endless liquid darkness that reflected the flames of the wreckage. She raised a hand. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She simply pointed at his sword, then at her own chest. The gesture was universal, transcending language and species. It was a request. Thomas lowered the blade, confusion warring with his training. "Demon!" he rasped, his voice rough and unused to speech after months of silence. The word felt small against the backdrop of the smoking crater. She shook her head. It was a small, frantic motion, human in its desperation. She tapped the side of her helmet, a sleek band of metal that encircled her temples, and suddenly, a voice echoed inside Thomas's skull. It wasn't sound, it was pure thought, cold and sharp as a winter wind, bypassing his ears and resonating directly in his mind. "Not demon," the voice projected, carrying a texture of static and pain. "Traveler. Broken. Thomas should have fled. The church would call this witchcraft. The king would call it a monster. But Thomas was no longer a servant of kings or churches. He was a man tired of death, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and found it wanting. Against every survival instinct he possessed, he knelt in the snow. The heat radiating from her suit was intense, thawing his frozen hands. He lifted the stranger into his arms. She was surprisingly light, her bone density seemingly different from a human's, yet she felt solid, real. He carried her out of the crater, away from the dying machine, and began the long, treacherous climb back to his cave. He brought her to his sanctuary, a hollow in the mountain protected from the wind, and laid her on his bed of matted furs and straw. For 3 days a blizzard raged outside, a wall of white that sealed them in and erased the world below. For 3 days, Thomas watched an alien die. He tended to her with the clumsy gentleness of a soldier. He offered her water from the melted ice, dried venison that was tough as leather, and hard, stale bread. She refused it all. Her biology seemed to reject the very matter of earth. She only accepted the heat of the fire, inching closer to the flames until Thomas feared she would burn, but her skin remained cool to the touch. As she lay there, fading, the mental connection between them grew stronger, involuntary, and overwhelming. Thomas began to dream her memories. When he slept, he was no longer in a cave in the Alps. He was drifting through nebulas of purple and gold. He saw worlds that defied description, cities of crystal floating in the crushing atmosphere of gas giants, fleets of silent, needle-like ships that drank the energy of dying suns to fuel their voyages. He felt the crushing loneliness of the void, the absolute silence between the stars that stretched for eternity. He realized with a vertigo that nearly sickened him that his God, his Pope, and his King were infinitesimally small, specks of dust arguing over a grain of sand on an infinite beach. But amidst the awe, amidst the visuals of galaxies spinning like great wheels of fire, he felt her fear. A terror so profound, so ancient, that it made the burning of the Templars feel like a petty squabble between children. On the 4th night, the storm broke. The wind died down, leaving a silence so deep it rang in the ears. The stranger, the woman from the stars, sat up. She was weak, her skin now translucent, veins pulsing with that silvery, mercury-like light. She looked at Thomas, who was sharpening his sword by the dying embers of the fire. For the first time, her black eyes showed moisture, tears, a human reaction from a creature that was anything but. "Thomas," she projected. He flinched at the use of his name. He hadn't told her. She had plucked it from the surface of his mind like a flower. "You are a warrior. You understand duty. You understand the oath." "I was a warrior," Thomas muttered to the fire, refusing to meet those void-like eyes. "Now I am nothing, a ghost haunting a mountain. You are a guardian," she corrected, the mental voice gaining a momentary strength. "My people, we watch, we search, we map the dark corners so that others may walk in the light." "Search for what?" Thomas asked, turning to face her. The firelight danced on her suit, making the shadows writhe. "For mercy," she replied. The word hung in the air, heavy and sad. She reached out, her long, cool fingers touching his weathered, scarred hand. The contact sent a jolt through him, a vision flashing before his eyes with the clarity of a lightning strike. He saw a signal, a beacon. He saw her ship moments before the crash, sending a desperate high-frequency pulse out into the dark. It was a distress call, and then he saw what would answer it. Great, dark shapes moving against the backdrop of the Milky Way. They were not ships. They were biological horrors the size of cities, swarms of consuming locusts made of metal and flesh. A hunting party, harvesters. They did not conquer, they erased. They stripped planets of their atmosphere, drank the oceans dry, and harvested biological life like crops to feed their endless hunger. "I am a scout," she told him, the thoughts weeping into his mind, carrying a flavor of immense guilt. "My vessel was damaged in the ambush. My biology is failing, but my ship, even in its death, is trying to save me. It is calling for help. It is broadcasting my heartbeat to the void." "Let them come," Thomas said, pulling his hand away, his mind reeling from the vision of the devouring swarm. "Let them save you. If they are your people, they will help." She shook her head, and the despair on her face broke his heart more than any torture he had endured. "No, Thomas, you do not understand. The ones who hear the call, they are not my people. They are the hunters, the silence makers. If they come, they will not just take me. They will take this world. They do not share. They consume. They will strip your mountains to the bedrock, drain your oceans, and harvest your people, your kings, your beggars, your priests, as biomass. There will be nothing left but a dead rock circling a cold sun." Thomas stared at her. The implication settled on him like a heavy shroud, colder than the snow outside. He stood up and walked to the mouth of the cave. The stars were bright, innocent points of light. He had always looked up at them with wonder. Now, he looked at them with dread. Somewhere up there, the dark shapes were turning, honing in on the signal of a beating heart hidden in the Swiss Alps. "You crashed on purpose," Thomas said, his voice flat. "It wasn't a question." "I tried to destroy the transmitter," she confessed, her mental voice a whisper of shame. "I tried to dive into the mountain to bury the signal. I failed. The beacon is active. It is biologically linked to my life signs. As long as I live, the signal broadcasts. As long as my heart beats, they are coming. They are fast, Thomas. They are already listening." The silence in the cave was heavier than the stone above them. The fire popped, a spark landing on the dirt floor and dying instantly. Thomas looked at the sword leaning against the wall, the blade he had used to defend pilgrims, to fight Saracens, to protect a temple that had betrayed him. He looked back at the woman. She was beautiful in a terrifying, alien way. She was innocent. She had come here not to conquer but to hide, perhaps to warn. "You want me to kill you," he said. The words tasted like ash. "I cannot do it," she projected, her mental voice trembling with a frustration that transcended species. "My conditioning, my genetic coding prevents self-termination. It is physically impossible for me to end my own life. It is a safeguard of my caste. We cannot give up. We cannot surrender to death. I need a guardian's mercy." This was the twist of the knife. This was the cosmic joke. He had saved her from the wreckage. He had warmed her, protected her, and begun to see her not as a monster, but as a fellow exile, someone cast out, broken, and alone. He had found a companion in the desolation, and now she was asking him to commit the one act he had sworn to leave behind. She was asking him to become the executioner. "Why?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "Why save us? You don't know us. We are cruel. We burn our own. We lie. We kill for gold and for gods who never speak back. We are not worth saving." The woman smiled, a sad, fragile expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. She projected one last memory into his mind, a gift. It was from the moment he found her. She saw herself through his eyes, broken, alien, terrifying, and she felt what he felt in that moment. Not hatred, Not fear, not disgust, but pity, compassion. She felt the warmth of his arms as he carried her through the snow, the clumsy gentleness of his hands as he covered her with furs. In a universe of cold indifference, in a galaxy of hunters and prey, she had found an anomaly. Because, she answered, the thought resonating with a profound, quiet truth, in all the stars I have traveled, mercy is the rarest element. It is rarer than platinum, rarer than starlight. I found it here, in you. A species capable of mercy is a species worth saving, even if they do not know it yet. Thomas stood there for a long time. The wind whistled outside, a mournful dirge. He thought of the brothers he had lost. He thought of the innocence he had lost. He realized that his entire life, his knighthood, his suffering, had all been leading to this single moment. He wasn't the last Templar because he had survived the purge. He was the last Templar because he had one final duty to perform. A duty not to a king or a pope, but to the world itself. He walked back to her. He picked up his sword. It felt heavier than it ever had in the Holy Land. The steel seemed to hum, sensing the gravity of the act. She lay back on the furs, exposing her neck. The pulsing veins of silver light beat a steady rhythm, the rhythm of the beacon calling the destroyers. She didn't close her eyes. She wanted him to see her gratitude. She wanted him to know that this was not murder. I will not ask God to forgive me, Thomas said, tears streaming down his face, freezing in his beard. For this is the only righteous thing I have ever done. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Thank you, she whispered in his mind, her voice fading, becoming light as a feather. Be at peace, last Templar. Look at the stars and know you are not alone. Thomas raised the blade. His hands did not shake. He was a professional, after all. He owed her a clean death. He owed her the mercy she had traveled across the galaxy to find. The strike was swift. The moment her heart stopped, the hum in the air vanished. The subtle vibration in the ground ceased. The lights on the distant wreckage outside, visible through the cave entrance, flickered and died. The signal was cut. High above the atmosphere, in the cold vacuum of space, the dark shapes that had begun to turn toward Earth paused. Blind once more, deaf to the tiny blue marble hidden in the dark, they turned back to the void, continuing their endless, hungry drift. Thomas buried her under a cairn of heavy stones on the ridge, overlooking the valley. He worked through the night, his hands bleeding, moving rocks until her body was safe from the wolves and the weather. He placed her helmet atop the grave, a strange, smooth artifact of a civilization he would never know. He stood there as the dawn broke, painting the snow in hues of pink and gold. The world below woke up. Farmers tended their fields, kings plotted their wars, and priests preached their sermons, completely unaware of how close they had come to extinction. They would never know that their future had been bought with the life of a woman from the stars and the soul of a broken knight. Thomas was still a wanted man. He was still hungry, cold, and alone. But as Sir Thomas of Acre turned his back on the grave and walked back into the darkness of his cave, the crushing weight of his isolation lifted. The kings of earth thought they held the power of life and death. They thought they owned the land and the people. But Thomas knew the truth. He had saved the world. He had held the cosmos in his arms and shown it kindness. And though his name would be forgotten, erased from history books and left to rot in the archives of the Inquisition, he carried a secret that warmed him more than any fire. He sat by the embers, watching the flames dance, and for the first time in years, the silence of the mountain didn't feel empty. It felt like a promise. It felt like mercy. And in the quiet dark, Thomas closed his eyes and finally, truly, slept.